privilege to bear during so much of my life and duty.
I'm 75 now, and I can't remember.
A private document from the late Queen revealed that she had left Thornfield Estate to her youngest grandchild, Prince James. But when the palace finally moved to honor her wishes, Prince William stepped in, raising serious questions inside the palace. Even Camilla found herself shut out of the conversation. Could there be a reason behind his sudden intervention? Join us as we find out. The Thornfield Estate Directive. James is the youngest grandchild of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, and he is also a nephew of King Charles III. He was born on December 17, 2007, at Frimley Park Hospital during the reign of his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II. At the moment of his birth, he entered the line of succession to the British throne in 8th place. Over the years, as new royal children were born and the family line expanded, his position gradually shifted. By 2016, he stands 16th in the order of succession. From birth until 2023, he was formally known as Viscount Severn, a courtesy title connected to his father's royal position. However, a significant change happened in March 2023 when his father was granted the title Duke of Edinburgh. Following this event, James began using the courtesy title Earl of Wessex, which is the most senior subsidiary title linked to his father's dukedom. Although the Dukedom of Edinburgh was created as a life peerage and will end when his father passes away, James remains the heir apparent to his father's hereditary title. James had just turned 18 when a document that had been sitting inside a sealed royal archive for years was finally brought forward. The late Queen Elizabeth had made a private decision long before her passing, one that had been carefully recorded by her personal advisors and kept away from the wider palace apparatus. She had set aside the Thornfield Estate, a privately held property outside the official Crown Estate portfolio, for her youngest grandchild. The timing of its transfer was tied directly to his 18th birthday, a milestone the Queen had clearly thought about in great detail before she passed. The document made it plain that her decision was not subject to the usual royal property review process. The Thornfield Estate sat on a stretch of land in the English countryside. It was not a grand palace or a publicly known royal residence. It was a private holding, one of several properties the Queen had accumulated over her lifetime through personal funds rather than crown resources. The estate had its own grounds, a main house, and a series of outbuildings that had been maintained properly over the years. It was the kind of place that did not appear on official registers of royal properties because it had never been part of the working estate. For years, it had simply existed, maintained by a small number of staff and kept out of public conversation entirely. When Charles was informed that the time had come to act on the directive, he received the news with great solemnity. He understood what it meant for the property to move to James. The directive had been written when the Queen was still in good health, long before the final years of her reign, and it carried the full weight of her personal intention. Charles spent time reviewing the original document carefully before taking any steps. He was aware that putting the transfer in motion would involve several layers of legal and administrative work, and he wanted to ensure that everything was handled correctly from the very beginning of the process. James himself had grown up largely out of the spotlight. His parents, Edward and Sophie, had always been deliberate about keeping him and his sister away from the pressures of royal public life. He had attended school, appeared at major royal events when it was appropriate, and had recently passed the age at which he could choose to adopt a princely title. He had followed his sister's example and chosen not to use that title, preferring instead to keep the lower-profile identity his parents had raised him with. But the arrival of the Thornfield Directive meant that his 18th birthday had a significance that went well beyond anything connected to titles or public duties. The news of the transfer was shared with a small number of senior palace advisors before it was communicated to the broader family. This was standard practice with matters involving private estates and personal gifts. The group of people who were involved kept the information tightly contained, but within a few days, word began to move in the way that information always does, carefully at first, then with increasing speed. The people who managed royal affairs for a living understood what a private directive from the late Queen represented. It was not something that could simply be set aside or reviewed by committee. It was an instruction from the woman who had led the monarchy for 70 years. What surprised many who learned of the directive was not that the Queen had left something personal to a grandchild, but that the terms were so specific. The document identified James by name, outlined the estate by its formal title, and made clear that the transfer was to happen on or shortly after his 18th birthday. There were no conditions attached beyond the age requirement, and there was no indication in the language of the directive that the Queen had expected this to be complicated. The complication came from the world she had left behind, and from the people in it who had their own views on what should happen next. Charles gave instructions for the formal process to begin. Advisors started working through the legal steps required to transfer a privately held property of this kind. The administrative work was methodical as usual, the kind of activity that happens inside the machinery of the royal household without any external notice. There was no reason at this stage to believe that the process would be anything other than precise. The Queen's wishes were clearly documented. James had reached the required age, and the mechanism for fulfilling the bequest was in place. Everything seemed to point toward a clean handover of a private property from one generation to the next. But there was one member of the family who had not yet been told, and whose reaction, once the news reached him, would change the entire shape of what followed. William learned about the Thornfield directive not through a formal briefing from his father, but through a conversation that was not meant to go as far as it did. By the time he understood what was happening and what it meant in terms of the estate's history and its connection to the broader royal landscape, his position on the matter had already formed. He was not going to let the process move forward without making his concerns known. William's formal challenge. The information reached William through a back channel, the kind of indirect path that sensitive palace issues sometimes travel when the usual lines of communication are slower than the pace of internal awareness. He had not been formally briefed by his father about the Thornfield directive, and this absence of a direct conversation was itself something William noted. By the time the picture became clear to him, he understood the full scope of what was in motion. The process of transfer had already begun. But what William found more pressing than the transfer itself was what the estate represented and what its removal from the main family structure could mean for the future. Thornfield was not a property that most people outside the senior royal household would recognize. It did not carry the public profile of Sandringham or Balmoral, but within the circles of people who understood how royal land and private holdings worked, it was known. The estate sat in a region with historical ties to the crown that went back further than anyone in the current generation had ever needed to think about. Its importance was not about the buildings or the land itself in purely practical terms. It was about what it represented as an asset held within the family's private portfolio, and about the precedent that would be set by moving it entirely outside the reach of future sovereign oversight. William moved quickly once he learnt the situation. His first action was not a confrontation or a direct appeal to his father, but a request for documentation. He wanted to see the original directive, the administrative paperwork already prepared, and any legal assessments that had been done in relation to the transfer. The request was framed formally and routed through the proper channels, which made it difficult for anyone to decline without drawing more attention to the matter. The people handling the administrative process understood what was happening when the request landed. William was not simply curious. He was beginning to build a position. The case William's advisors started to construct was grounded in the question of custodianship. The argument was not that James had no right to receive something the Queen had personally chosen to give him. The argument was that Thornfield, given its history and its specific characteristics as a landholding, belonged in the custodial care of the heir to the throne rather than in private individual ownership outside the direct line of succession. This was a distinction that sounded technical, but carried real weight in the way royal property matters were handled. William was not challenging James personally. He was challenging the category into which the estate was being placed by the transfer. His legal team began reviewing documents that linked Thornfield to the broader history of Crown-adjacent land management. This was painstaking work done over several days, and it produced a picture that gave William's advisors a platform to stand on. They found references in older administrative records that described the estate in terms that suggested it had been understood, at least by some who had managed it, as more than a purely personal asset. Whether those references would hold up under formal scrutiny was another matter, but they were enough to give rise to a formal challenge. The goal at this stage was not to win outright, but to force a pause in the process. William sent a formal communication to his father, requesting that the transfer be delayed, pending a review of the estate's legal standing. The tone of the letter was measured, careful in its framing, and impossible to dismiss without creating a bigger problem. Charles received it during a week already full of other pressures, and the addition of a formal challenge from his son and heir made an already complicated situation more serious. The letter did not make demands. It made an argument and asked for time. But in the context of a royal household where title and timing carry huge significance, the message was understood for exactly what it was saying. The people around William noticed a shift in his focus during this period. He was attentive and systematic in the way he approached each step. He was also careful not to let his position become publicly known before he had made his case to his father directly. The last thing he wanted was for the matter to become a story about family conflict. He wanted it to remain a question of institutional responsibility, because that framing gave him the strongest possible ground. Questions about proper stewardship of historic assets were entirely legitimate, and William knew exactly which of those two versions of the story he needed this to be. Behind all of this was a deeper awareness that William carried with him constantly. Every decision made now, every asset moved or settled, would eventually become part of the world he would inherit as king. He watched the way Charles managed the family's holdings with the eyes of someone who knew that he would one day be responsible for all of it. The Thornfield situation was not simply about one estate or one grandchild's inheritance. It was about the kind of monarch he intended to be, and about the message that would be sent if a property of this nature moved out of the framework he would need to govern effectively. Caught in the middle. Charles received William's letter and set it aside for several hours before responding. He had learned over many years that his first reaction to pressure was not always his most useful one, and the message from his son required the kind of careful thinking that could not be rushed. The request was framed in reasonable terms, but what it asked for was significant. It asked Charles to pause a process that had been set in motion to honor the late Queen's personal wishes. To do that without very strong justification would mean choosing the preferences of the living over the clearly documented intentions of the deceased, and Charles understood that this was not a small thing. He called a private meeting with two of his most senior advisors to talk through the situation. The meeting was held without any written agenda, and no formal record was kept of what was discussed. Charles wanted space to think out loud, without creating documentation that could later be reviewed or cited. The advisors listened, asked careful questions, and offered their assessment of the competing pressures involved. On one side sat the legal and personal weight of the Queen's directive. On the other sat the formal challenge from the Prince of Wales, which carried its own institutional gravity simply by virtue of who had sent it. Neither side of the situation was easy to dismiss. Charles had spent his entire life watching his mother manage the tensions between her role as sovereign and her role as the head of a family. She had been skilled at holding both identities simultaneously, making decisions that served the institution while still preserving the dignity and interests of the people she loved. He had not always agreed with how she handled those tensions, but he had come to understand the discipline required to do it. Now he was in the seat she had occupied, and the challenge in front of him had the same essential shape as many she had faced. A family matter had become an institutional one, and the lines between the two were not clear. The pressure from William was real and sustained. It was not the kind of pressure that would simply dissolve if ignored for long enough. William's legal team was working, recording was being gathered, and the formal communication channel had been opened. To not respond substantively within a reasonable time would send its own message that Charles had received the challenge and chosen not to engage with it, which would only intensify the situation. At the same time, Charles was deeply reluctant to signal to his household and to the memory of his mother that a personal directive from the late Queen could be paused whenever a sufficiently powerful family member raised an objection. Inside the palace, the tension became visible to the people whose jobs required them to be close to both men. Staff, who worked across different parts of the household, began noticing that the usual easy flow of information between Charles's office and William's had become slower and more formal. Requests that would ordinarily be acknowledged quickly were taking longer to move. Scheduling conversations that would typically happen without friction were being handled with extra care. None of this was obvious to an outside observer, but to the people inside the system, these small changes in the texture of daily operations showed clearly that something important was unresolved. Charles also had to consider James, and through James, Edward and Sophie. He had a close relationship with his youngest brother, and Sophie had been one of the most reliable and consistent members of the working family through some of its most difficult years. To override the Queen's bequest to their son, or even to delay it significantly without a compelling justification, would send a message to Edward and Sophie about how much weight their family branch carried in decisions made at the center of the institution. Charles was sensitive to this. The Edinburgh family had always operated with loyalty and without drama, and he did not want to respond to that loyalty by leaving them uncertain about where they stood. The days that followed were among the most personally difficult Charles had experienced since taking the throne. The combination of grief, because every decision connected to the Queen's estate still carried the pain of her absence, and institutional responsibility made each step feel heavier than it might otherwise have been. He worked through his options gradually, speaking with his private secretary, reviewing legal summaries, and spending long stretches of time in his private study with the original Thornfield document in front of him. The Queen had been clear. The question was whether clarity was enough to hold the line against the weight of what William was bringing to bear. Out of bound. Camilla had learned that a family dispute was unfolding from a brief written note that arrived through the internal household communication system. The note was short, informing her only that a matter involving a private estate and the late Queen's personal directives was under internal review. It did not invite her participation. It did not ask for her opinion. It made no mention of when or whether she would be brought into the conversation. To most people reading such a note, the meaning would have been apparent instantly. She was being informed rather than consulted, which was a meaningful distinction in a world where the difference between the two carried significant institutional weight. The decision to exclude Camilla from the key discussions about Thornfield had not been made randomly. It reflected a position that had been held by some within Charles's senior circle for years, which was that certain matters involving the late Queen's bloodline and her personal wishes were properly confined to those directly connected to that line. Camilla had been Queen Consort for 3 years, but her relationship with the Queen had been complex over many decades, and the idea that her input was needed, or appropriate, in a dispute about what the Queen had left to her youngest grandchild was not one that everyone around Charles was willing to support. The distinction being made was between Camilla's role as Queen and her standing as a family member with a legitimate voice in deeply personal inheritance questions. In formal, public, and ceremonial terms, her position was respected. But in the internal, private deliberations of a family working through a sensitive matter tied to the Queen's legacy, the people managing the process had drawn a line. She was on the outside of that line, and the note she received made this fact plain without ever stating it directly. This was how the palace communicated uncomfortable realities, not through confrontation, but through the quiet management of access and information. Camilla's response to the exclusion was controlled. She said nothing about it, and her schedule of engagements continued without interruption. She attended a series of events with the composure that those who knew her well recognized as the particular kind of steadiness she deployed when something had unsettled her, but she had decided not to show it. The people closest to her in her personal household noticed a quality of stillness in her that was different from her usual manner. She was present and engaged on the outside, but the energy she normally brought to informal moments was subdued in a way that suggested she was carrying something she had not yet decided how to address. Charles was aware that she had received the note and that she understood its implications. He had not found a moment to speak with her directly about it before the note was sent, and by the time he recognized that this had been an oversight in how the situation was handled, the information was already with her. He chose not to revisit the subject with a follow-up conversation immediately, partly because his attention was consumed by the competing pressures of the William situation, and partly because he knew that opening the conversation would require him to either defend the decision to exclude her or to walk it back in a way that would complicate the boundary that had been set. Neither option felt manageable in the middle of everything else. The exclusion of Camilla sent a signal that moved silently through the parts of the household that paid attention to such things. People who worked at the intersection of the two households, the king's and the queen's, registered what had happened and what it said about the internal dynamics of a family still working out how to position itself in relation to the queen's memory. There was no hostility in how this was being done. There was simply a closed door where an open one might have been, and the people who noticed it understood that closed doors in this environment were never accidental. For Camilla, the experience added a layer of complexity to a role she had spent years carefully and intentionally building. She had learned the institution from the inside over many decades, had navigated some of its most difficult passages, and had arrived at a position of formal dignity that very few would have predicted possible in the years when the public's attitude toward her had been at its most cruel. To find herself excluded from a family conversation of this kind was a reminder that position and genuine belonging were not always the same thing, and that the distance between them could still open without warning, even after everything she had done to close it. James holds his ground. As the back and forth between Charles and William continued, James moved at his own pace. He had grown up in a household that prized peace over public expression, and the same quality that had allowed him to stand vigil at his grandmother's coffin at 15 without faltering was the quality he brought to the situation now. He was 18, newly into adulthood, and had just declined the opportunity to adopt a princely title, a decision that said something about the kind of path he intended to walk. He wasn't a person who reached for more than what he felt was genuinely his, and the Thornfield Estate did not feel like a reach. It felt like a gift from a grandmother who had thought about what she wanted for him. James had people around him who helped him understand what was happening. Edward and Sophie had always made sure that their children were equipped to think independently and to understand the environment they were part of. James was not left to navigate the situation alone. His parents were aware of the dispute, aware of William's formal challenge, and aware that Charles was under pressure from both sides. They were careful not to push James toward any particular response, but they made sure he had access to the right counsel so that when the moment came for him to make his position known, he would do so with clarity and confidence rather than hesitation born from being underprepared. The way James communicated his intention was characteristically indirect. He did not write a formal letter to William or request a meeting with Charles to argue his case. Instead, he made his position known through the people around him who were in regular contact with the palace machinery. The message was straightforward. He intended to accept the estate as his grandmother had wished, and he saw the matter as a personal one between himself and the woman who had raised his father, attended his christening, and held him at the vigil for his grandfather. Apparently, he was not challenging anyone. The message landed in the right places and was understood immediately. James was not escalating. He was not threatening. He was not doing any of the things that would have made the situation easier to dismiss or to frame as youthful impulsiveness. He was simply making clear that he had no intention of stepping aside from something that had been given to him with full power and recorded with full legal effect. He was behaving with the kind of measured steadiness that made it hard for anyone to argue that he was unready to receive what his grandmother had left him, or that his position on the matter was anything less than considered and firm. William received the news of James's position through his own channels. He understood what it meant, that the situation had moved beyond a simple administrative pause and had become a matter of competing intentions within the family. James had not challenged him directly, but the message was clear enough. The youngest grandchild of the late Queen was not going to yield, and this fact changed the calculation for everyone involved. William had built a legal and institutional argument, but arguments of that kind ultimately required someone to make a final decision, and that person was Charles. The question was no longer whether the process would be contested. The question was what Charles would do when he could no longer defer the moment of decision. Charles felt the pressure from both sides converging. The legal review that William's team had conducted had produced material worth taking seriously, but it had not produced anything definitive enough to override a clear personal directive from the late Queen. James had made his wishes known without drama and with complete composure. Edward and Sophie were watching from a careful distance, their silence itself a form of expectation. The advisors around Charles were deeply divided, and every option they laid before him carried consequences far beyond the immediate moment. Some argued that honoring the Queen's directive completely would set a lasting precedent, allowing personal gifts to move outside the usual royal inheritance structure. Others warned that delaying or redirecting the transfer might protect the institution but create a misleading message. It would tell a loyal grandson, already grieving his grandmother's loss, that her final wishes could be questioned, even within her own family. In the end, the decision would fall to Charles alone. No committee could make it for him. No legal review could remove the human weight at its center, and no amount of careful management could change the fact that whatever he decided would be remembered by James, by William, by Edward and Sophie, and by the institution itself, as a statement about which kind of obligation mattered more when the two came into direct conflict. The memory of the Queen sat over all of it, not as a reproach, but as the originating fact from which everything else had followed, and from which there was no clean or costless way to move. What are your thoughts on William's decision to go against his late grandmother's wish? Do you think James deserves to receive the estate as instructed by the late Queen?